Spring 1998, Eastern Ridge, Cabell County, West Virginia. A surveyor finds a foundation that shouldn't exist. No deed, no records, just collapsed stone and rotted timber buried under a century of forest growth. Inside the cellar, beneath the decay, 3 leather journals, a rusted lantern, and a child's wooden doll, its face burned completely off. He drops his equipment, walks down the mountain, never files his report. 6 months later, the county sends someone back. The foundation has been covered, stones piled over the entrance, deliberately. No one in the hollow will say who did it, but they all know the name that used to live there, the Hollow Ridge Widow. What she did to her 5 sons in 1901 was so methodical, so complete, that even the pastor who found them refused to document it. This is that story. Before we begin, if you want more forgotten histories like this, subscribe and hit the bell. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps us keep bringing you these untold stories. The drowning her name was Edith Marlo. Spring 1900. Her husband drowns in the Guyandotte River during a flood. She's 41 years old, left with 5 sons and no daughters. The oldest is 23. The youngest, Thomas, is only 9. They live 7 miles from the nearest town, connected by a logging road that washes out every winter. The neighbors say she took the death like scripture quiet, faithful, unshaken. But something changed after the burial. When neighbors brought food, she wouldn't let them pass the porch. She'd stand in the doorway, hands folded, thanking them in a voice barely above a whisper. Behind her, visible through the door, all 5 sons sitting perfectly still at the table, watching her, waiting. By summer 1901, the Marlos stopped coming to town entirely. Daniel, the oldest, used to make supply runs every 2 weeks. Flour, salt, basic provisions. After June, he vanished. The general store owner, Virgil Cass, noted it in his ledger. The Marlos still owed credit. Late July, he sends his nephew up the ridge to collect. The boy returns 3 hours later, pale and stuttering. The widow met him at the gate, paid the full debt with coins he'd never seen before, currency, tarnished silver. She told him they wouldn't need supplies anymore, that the Lord had shown her a different way. When he asked about Daniel, she smiled. The boy later said it wasn't a cruel smile. It was worse. It was the smile of someone who believed, beyond all doubt, that she was righteous. The logging crews working the ridges that summer noticed something else. Smoke rising from the Marlo cabin at odd hours. Not cooking smokes something thicker, sweeter. On certain nights, when the wind came down through the hollow, they heard singing, not hymns, just one voice, low and steady, repeating the same melody over and over, until it sounded less like worship and more like instruction. One foreman, Horace Thorne, walked up toward the property line one evening to check on the family. He got within 50 yards of the clearing, all 5 sons standing in a circle in the yard, shirtless, heads bowed. In the center, the widow holding a Bible open with both hands. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, but The sons turned their heads in perfect unison. Horace left, told his crew they weren't to go near that ridge again. The silence by autumn, the rumours began. Not loud rumours these, were whispered in over card games, behind closed doors. Some said the widow had gone strange with grief, that she'd decided her husband's death was punishment, that she was trying to atone. Others said it was deeper, that she believed her bloodline had been chosen, that God took her husband so she could raise her sons into something purer, something unbroken by the outside world. Reverend Amos Tripp rode up to the cabin twice that fall. The first time, she spoke through the door, said they were well, said they were praying. The second time, she didn't answer at all, but he could hear movement inside. Footsteps, breathing, bend, somewhere deeper in the house's sound, like sobbing that stopped the moment he knocked again. Thomas, the youngest, was 9 years old that spring, small for his age, quiet, the kind of boy who'd hide behind his mother's skirts when strangers came. By October, the logging crews no longer saw him in the yard, not fetching water, not playing, not anywhere. One crew member, Carl Decker, mentioned it to his wife. She told him not to pee her wife, that mountain families kept to themselves. But Carl couldn't shake it. He'd seen Thomas once in town, holding his mother's hand, staring at a peppermint stick in the store window, like it was the only beautiful thing in the world. Carl bought it for him. Thomas whispered thank you so quietly he almost didn't hear. Now that war was gone, and no one seemed to care. November, a traveling preacher named Elijah Cole passes through Cabell County. He doesn't know the families or the land, but he's heard about the widower woman who lost her husband and turned to scripture with obsessive devotion. He thinks she sounds like someone who needs guidance. So he rides up the ridge one gray afternoon, uninvited, Bible under his arm. He knocks. The widow answers. She looks older than 41. Hair tied back so tightly it pulls at her temples. Hands raw, chapped, stained dark under the nails. He tells her he's come to pray with her, to help her through her grief. She stares at him for a long time. Then she says something that makes him step backward off the porch. Grief is a luxury. Suffering is the first condition of purity. My sons are finally learning what it means to be born again. Elijah leaves, doesn't tell the sheriff, doesn't file a report. He later writes to a colleague that he didn't see madness in her eyes. He saw certainty, the kind that can't be reasoned with or prayed away. He said, she looked at him the way a prophet looks at a non-believer, not with anger, but with pity, like he was the one who didn't understand. That winter, the smoke from the Marlo cabin stopped rising. No movement in the windows, no tracks in the snow. It was as if the family had sealed themselves inside. When spring came, the silence from that ridge was so complete that even the birds seemed to avoid it. The discovery, April 16th, 1902. Reverend Amos Tripp makes the decision to go back up the ridge. He'd spent the winter troubled by dreams, visions of boys standing in darkness, reaching toward light they couldn't touch. His wife begs him to leave it alone. But Amos can't sleep anymore. He rides up alone just after dawn, mist still clinging to the trees. The closer he gets, the quieter the woods become. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his horse's breath and the creak of leather. When he reaches the clearing, he sees the front door standing open, not broken, not forced, just open. Like an invitation, he calls out. No answer. The smell hits him before he reaches the steps, not to decay, but something old, sour, stale, like air that hadn't moved in months. Inside, the front room is empty. The table is set. 5 wooden bowls, 5 spoons, a loaf of bread in the center, uneaten, covered in mold. The chairs are pushed back, as if everyone stood up at the same moment and never sat down again. On the wall above the hearth, carved deep into the wood, the line must not break. The blood must stay pure. He moves deeper into the house. The back room covered in straw, old blankets piled in corners, on the walls, scratched into the plaster with fingernails or something sharp. Names: Daniel, Isaac, Caleb, Thomas, Ezra, written over and over in columns. Beneath each name, tally marks. Some had 5, some had 12. Some had so many they bled together, impossible to count. Amos doesn't understand what he's looking at, not yet, but his hands are shaking. He turns toward the cellar door. It's latched from the outside, heavy iron bolt, rusted but locked. He hesitates, prays quietly, then pulls the bolt free. The smell that rises from below makes him gag. He lights a match and descends the stone steps. The cellar is narrow, cold, walls wet with condensation. In the far corner, curled against the stone, 2 hot boys, emaciated, skin pale as wax, clothes rotted through. He can't tell how long they've been dead. Days, weeks, maybe longer. But what stops him cold, what makes him drop the match and stumble backward in the darkness of what? S, carved into the floor beside him, a circle, symbols inside. And at the center, written in something dark and flaming, she said, "We were clean." The sheriff arrives that afternoon with 3 men. They bring the bodies up and lay them in the yard under canvas. The coroner examines them where they lay, dead no more than 2 weeks. Starvation, dehydration, but there are other marks. Bruising around wrists and ankles, old scars across the back, and something else he notes in his report but never speaks aloud. Evidence of prolonged confinement, evidence of depravity inconsistent with natural family structure. He burns his notes 3 days later, but the sheriff had already read them. They find the widow half a mile from the cabin, kneeling beside the stream, washing her hands over and over. The water runs clear, but her hands keep moving, scrubbing at skin already raw and blue. She doesn't resist, doesn't speak. She looks up at the sheriff with eyes that seem to see through him into some other place in time. They ask where the other sons are. She smiles, not with malice, but peace. They're with their father. The work is done. The bloodline has been made pure. When they press her, she begins reciting scripture, verses about sacrifice, about Abraham and Isaac, about the trials that separate the faithful from the faith. She never stops smiling. They find the other 3 sons 2 days later, buried in shallow graves behind the home. Daniel, Isaac, and Caleb. The oldest had been 24. They'd been dead. Months buried, sometime during the deep winter when the ground is still frozen. The coroner can't determine exact cause of death for all of them, but Daniel shows signs of blunt trauma to the skull. Isaac has rope burns around his neck. Caleb's body is too decomposed to say, but in the dirt beside him, they find a journal. It belonged to him. The entries stop in January 1902. The last page is barely legible, written in a trembling hand. She told us we were Adam's sons, that we had to rebuild Eden, that the only sin was refusal. I tried to leave. Daniel tried to stop me. She killed him for mercy. She said he'd been weak. She said the rest of us had to be stronger. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your family? The aftermath, the widow is taken to the county jail. She never stands trial. Within a week, she stops eating, stops speaking. She sits in her cell with hands folded, staring at the wall, moving her lips in silent prayer. The guard says she looks peaceful, like someone who decompleted a great work and was simply waiting for God to call her home. She dies on May 2nd, 1902. The doctor lists cause of death as self-starvation. But the guard who found her says her face looked wrong, not peaceful, frozen, like she'd seen something in those final moments that even faith couldn't prepare her for. The county buries the sons in unmarked graves at the edge of the church cemetery. No headstones, no service. Reverend Tripp refuses to speak of them. He later writes to the diocese that he did unknow what words could sanctify what had been done, that some acts exist outside the language of grace. The congregation never speaks the Marlo name again. It becomes a kind of covenant, a shared silence. When new families move into the hollow, no one tells them what happened on that ridge. The cabin is dismantled by summer's end. The stone foundation left to collapse. The land is abandoned. No one will buy it. No one will farm it. It simply returns to the woods, as if the earth itself wanted to forget. The journals, but the journals remained. The 3 leather-bound books found in 1998 were turned over to the County Historical Society. They were catalogued, briefly examined, then sealed in storage with a notation. Contains sensitive material, genealogical records of a disturbed nature, restricted access. 2 historians were allowed to read them in 1999. Both requested anonymity. One later described the contents in an interview. The journals were written by the widow. They spanned 3 years. The entries begin as prayers, supplications for strength after her husband's death, meditations on scripture. But by the 2nd year, the tone changes. She writes about visions, dreams where God speaks to her directly. He tells her that her sons were given to her for a purpose, that her husband's bloodline has been chosen, that the world outside the ridge is corrupt, tainted by sin, by mixture, by the weakness of modern thought. She writes that her sons are the last pure branch of a sacred tree, that if they're to survive, to remain untouched by the fallen world, they must be bound to each other, not as brothers, as something older, something Adam's sons would have understood before the flood, before the nations scattered and the blood went thin. She believed she was saved. The entries detail a system, a structure. She rotated the suns, kept records, marked the days. She writes about their resistance, at first Daniel's anger, Isaac's silence, Caleb's attempts to run. She writes about how she broke them, not with violence, with scripture, with patience, with the slow, grinding certainty that she was right and they were lost without her guidance. She writes about Thomas, the youngest, how he cried every night until he stopped crying altogether, how she praised him for that, called it surrender, told him surrender was the same as faith. The final entries are the worst. They're calm, grateful. The widow thanks God for the clarity, for the strength to see it through, for the sons who finally understood. She writes that the line is pure now, that the blood has been made clean, that she can rest. The Historical Society resealed the journals in 2000. They were moved to a climate-controlled vault in Charleston. No copies made, no photographs taken. The director said it was to protect the dignity of descendants. But there were no descendants. The Marlo line ended on that ridge in 1902. What they were really protecting was something else. The idea that faith, isolated and absolute, can become indistinguishable from madness. That conviction without witness turns inward. That a mother's love, twisted through scripture and grief, can justify anything, even the destruction of her own children. The journals proved she wasn't insane. She was a believer, and that was somehow worse. The Ridge today, in 2004, a documentary crew tried to film at the site. They were denied permits. The county cited safety concerns and stable ground. But locals said it was something else. That people who went up to that ridge came back different, quiet. They said the woods felt wrong. That even in daylight, the clearing where the cabin stood was darker than it should be. That cameras malfunctioned. That audio recordings picked up sounds no one heard while they were there. Whispers, humming, a woman's voice, low and steady, reciting something that might have been prayer. The crew left after 2 days, never released the footage. One producer said later it wasn't about belief in ghosts. It was about the weight of what happened there. The way certain places hold on to suffering. The way evil, when it believes itself righteous, leaves a mark that doesn't fade. The surveyor who found the journals in 1998 never went back to that part of the county. He sold his equipment 6 months later and moved to Ohio. Years later, he said he still thought about the door, the one with the burned face. He didn't know which son it belonged to. Didn't know if the widow burned it as punishment or as some kind of ritual. But he remembered holding it and feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with the cellar air. He said it felt like grief, like something that had been loved once and then made into a lesson. He left it there when he covered the site back up. It felt wrong to take it, like disturbing a grave. The truth is, no one knows how many people in Cabell County still remember the Marlo family. The old families, the ones whose grandfathers worked the ridges. They know, but they don't talk. The new families, the ones who moved in over the last 50 years, have never heard the name. The ridge is state forest now, unmarked trails. Hunters pass through in the fall, hikers in the spring. Most of them never know they're walking over the foundation of that cabin, over graves that were never marked, over the clearing where 5 sons stood in a circle while their mother held a Bible and told them they were blessed. And maybe that's mercy. Maybe some stories are supposed to be forgotten. But every few years, someone finds something. A rusted lantern, a page from a journal, a carving in a tree. The line must not break, and the silence starts to crack. The widow believed she was saving her sons. She believed it when she locked them in that cellar, when she carved her prayers into the walls, when she watched them waste away and called it purification. She believed it when she died, and that belief, more than the bodies, more than the journals, more than the foundation buried under 100 years of leaves. What haunts that ridge? Not the ghosts of the sons, but the certainty of the mother. The knowledge that somewhere in the dark mathematics of faith and isolation, she found a logic that made sense to her, and no amount of time or silence or soil can bury that. If you made it this far, you've heard something most people will never know. Something the county tried to forget. Something the church refused to sanctify. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you believe a story like this could be true. And if you're ever driving through West Virginia, through the hills where the roads wash out and the hollows go quiet, remember this: some families keep secrets, and some secrets keep families, until there's nothing left but the wind, the woods, and the weight of what was done in the name of love. This has been Lost History, Docs. Subscribe for more forgotten stories, because the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be found.